Hi everyone, I'm Brea and we're going to be getting into my July wrap up today. Usually I do a quarterly wrap up, but I learned that the procrastinator in me will not actually film that video at the end of the quarter because I'm like, man, I don't even remember reading some of these books, and I definitely don't feel like writing reviews for 15 or 20 books at one time. So I figured that going forward I would just do it monthly, regardless if I'm reading 3 books in a month or if I'm reading 10 books in a month, that I would just do it in one month so that my thoughts and my feelings and my emotions are fresh, because this memory up here isn't the best. Let's just say that. And so also going into July, I was coming out of a reading slump. So I told myself, I'm just gonna read whatever I'm in the mood for. And turns out I was in the mood for a lot of thrillers. So in the month of July, I read 6 thrillers. That's all I read. 6 thrillers, and they all ranged in enjoyment for me, to be honest. So let's just get started. I'm just gonna go in the order in which I read them. And the first book that I read was Notes on an Execution, and I'm doing this because I can't seem to find my physical copy, even though I know I own it. And me not finding it probably has a little bit to do of my book room currently looking like this. But make sure you're subscribed because I am definitely doing a reading room office makeover here shortly. But anyways, Notes on an Execution is about the serial killer who is on death row, and we're getting his perspective as he is reminiscing on some of his actions, as well as him trying to get out of death row. And we're also following the perspective of 3 women that were in his life. And so this book is unlike any thriller that I have ever read, and I think it's thrilling, and I'll put thrilling in quotation marks, because it really has this sense of reality that I wasn't expecting going into it. And it's just the reality of what drives some people to violence, whether they have a reason for it or not. You know, the reality of how some people grew up, the reality of just some circumstances that people were dealt in life, the reality of you know, believing the best in people, and you know, possibly being at the wrong place at the wrong time. And so it wasn't one of those thrillers where you were on the edge of your seat the entire time because you know who the serial killer is, and so there's no real surprise element there. But it was an interesting book because it does kind of make you think about our criminal justice system. It made me think about the death penalty. But I really did enjoy this book. I did give it 4 out of 5 stars. I feel like I didn't give it a full 5 stars just because I think my expectations going into the book were a little skewed, which has nothing to do with the book. It's not you, it's me. And then another book that I don't physically own, but I absolutely need to, is Grown by Tiffany D. Jackson. And this is another thriller that has a scary amount of reality kind of thrown in there. So in Grown, we follow this young girl named Enchanted who has this dream of being a famous singer, and she ends up encountering this man named Corey Fields, who is this very famous, well-known musician. And so he takes her under his wing to mentor her, to help her become a star. And in this process, she ends up being groomed and abused. And I feel like this book can be triggering for a multitude of reasons. For me specifically, Tiffany D. Jackson did a really good job of depicting the manipulation on Corey's end. There was just some moments where I was listening to it on audio and I'd be like, this mother... It's obvious that this book was written in a reminiscent way of a real life story that I'm sure a lot of people are very familiar with, a very famous hip-hop R&B artist. And I think Tiffany was really successful in what she sought out to do with this book, and her works are just so gut-wrenching. This is the second Tiffany D. Jackson that I have read this year, and I would definitely continue to read her books because both books that I've read from her this year have been 5 stars. And so if I get one more 5-star from Tiffany D. Jackson, she is on my favorite authors of all time list. And then the next book I read in July was The Family Game by Catherine Steadman. And so I really picked this book up based off the sole recommendation of a coworker. So I have a coworker who she is the thriller girly. She almost strictly reads thrillers, and so she came by my desk and was like, Brea, you need to read The Family Game. This is unlike any thriller I have ever read. And after reading this, I understand why she made that claim. However, I do think it is a very bold claim to make. And so in the story, we are following a woman named Harriet, and she is dating this man who comes from a very well-to-do family. His family is very well known, very A-list. They are very rich and prestigious, but they also keep things in their family a very big secret. And so Harriet finally gets introduced to this family, and she realizes that this family likes to play these really bizarre, weirdo type of games. Right? And so when Robert, the head of the family, who is like the father, dad, CEO of the company, all of that, pulls her into a room and gives her this tape with a confession on it, she's not sure if it's just one of these weird twisted games that the family plays or if this family is dangerous. And I'm not gonna lie, this book got real freaking wild at the end. And I feel like I was so intrigued by this because in my real life, I don't really care about famous people that much, but I always have this thought in my head that once you reach a certain status, some weird stuff has to just be going on in the background, right? Just weird, creepy things, right? And so that part of my brain was really intrigued by this because we are following one of those like prestigious families, and like even though it gets really wild at the end, I'm like, I can believe it. I can believe it. But the pacing of this was great. I honestly didn't figure out the twist until it was handed to me on a silver platter. I will say though, the reason I'm not giving this 5 stars is because there was this like romantic element or this romantic insinuation throughout the book that actually didn't end up leading anywhere, and so it felt very unneeded to me. But other than that, I really enjoyed this book. I think this book and this thriller will work for a lot of people, and so I ended up giving this 4 stars. And then we have The Final Girl Support Group by Grady Hendrix, and the title of this book is very indicative of the main premise. And so a final girl is someone who is a sole survivor of a mass murder, and this book kicks off pretty quickly as we meet the women in this support group. We learn that one of the women that's originally in this support group is murdered, and shortly after that, someone starts to hunt down the rest of the women in this group. And so our protagonist has been paranoid from the jump. Ever since she went through her traumatizing experience, she has gone through great lengths to make sure that she stays safe. So when she finds out that someone is hunting them, she is like, see you later. I'm on the run. I am not about to be traumatized again. But somehow she ends up in this whirlwind of events where she's actually trying to figure out who is killing all of these women or hunting these women down in the support group. I think this book has a lot of interesting conversations about sensationalizing and monetizing real life trauma. Like, it definitely goes into, obviously this is a fictional book, but it goes into how some of these women's stories were made into movies and TV shows and all of that, which I think is very relevant to like our current society. And I'm someone who, you know, I do watch true crime and stuff, and so it did have me questioning myself a little bit about the types of money that people are making on the backs of like real people's trauma. So I do think that was an interesting conversation that was kind of touched on in here. However, I struggled with connecting with this main character, and I don't know if it's just because I couldn't trust the main character or just her in general and some of the decisions that she was making and some of the decisions that all of the characters were making. I was just like, what? And so it was hard for me to just root for anybody in this book, and I wasn't connected to any character enough to care about who was the one that was doing the killing, who was being killed. I just stopped caring at a certain point. And it's tough to explain why, because I feel like all of the elements that I typically enjoy in a thriller are in this book, especially because I'm someone who is learning that I do enjoy the soul survivor slash final girl trope. And so the fact that this is following a whole group of final girls, I would think that it was something that I was really going to enjoy. However, just the execution just did not land for me. But I can understand how this is going to be successful for a lot of people. I understand why a lot of people enjoy this book. I would give Grady Hendrix another go, but unfortunately, this just wasn't a hit for me. And so I was debating between giving this like a 2.5 and a 3, but I know that I was gonna round up at least on a 3 for a good read, so we'll just give it a 3. And one of my favorite books that I've read this month was Drowning by TJ Newman. And so Drowning follows this plane who, after 6 minutes in the air, they end up crashing into the water. And due to the circumstances that are outside of the plane, some people decide that it isn't safe for them to evacuate on top of the water, and they stay in the plane. However, the plane ends up then going into the water. So these people are submerged in a plane underneath the water. And so we are following this group of people as they are trying to figure out how to survive, because there is only a certain amount of oxygen left in that cabin for them to live. And so they have about 5 or 6 hours before they need to get out of that plane. We're not only following the people in the plane that are fighting for survival, but we are also following the people that are trying to save them. And so there is a father and daughter duo on the plane that is actually related to someone who is in the rescue crew that is trying to figure out how do we get to this plane. And so I think TJ Newman does a really good job of writing humanity, especially humanity in a crisis, and how it's not a one size fits all of how people are going to react. There are going to be some people who step up, and there's going to be other people who are just going to go into fight or flight, and they are just going to be there to survive. But it's interesting to me because after I read this book, I did read some of the reviews of people who didn't enjoy this, and it mostly boiled down to people saying this isn't realistic. And I'm like, well, yeah, it's about a plane with people in it underneath the water. Like, when have we ever heard of that happening? Like, it's not supposed to be realistic, so you do have to suspend a little bit of disbelief to kind of really get into the book. But I'll also say that there was this element of grief that was covered in the book that I wasn't expecting, that was just like an added layer to the story that I usually don't get in thrillers. And so when I tell you I was crying at the end of this book, yes, I'll say it again, I was crying at the end of a thriller. And I don't think this book is gonna win any like literary awards or anything like that, but what TJ Newman set out to do, I think she was successful in. And the fact that the book was so fast paced, I felt satisfied at the end. I felt like all of the questions that could have possibly come up in this scenario were answered for me. And then on top of that, the way that she wrote humanity, how she handled the topic of grief, and how she did it in such a quick way. This isn't a long book by any means. The audiobook, sped up at like a 1.8 speed, was like 4.5 hours. I think the book is around 300 pages. Like, the fact that she was able to do all of that in such a short amount of time and such a short amount of space, I think was really, really special. And so I gave this book 5 stars instantly. I was up at night, reading late, wanting to stay up to try to finish this book. I was on the edge of my seat the entire time. I cared about the characters. I cared about the people rescuing the plane. I loved it. I absolutely loved it. And I loved it so much that I decided to go back and read the first novel that she put out. So Drowning is the second novel. Falling is her debut novel. And you might be wondering, why does she keep writing stuff on planes? TJ Newman is an ex-flight attendant, so she's pulling from a lot of her knowledge of flights and people and things that happen on flights. And so I'm just gonna read the inside flap because it is so short, but it gets to the synopsis of the book so well. It says, you just boarded a flight to New York. There are 143 other passengers on board. What you don't know is that 30 minutes before the flight, your pilot's family was kidnapped. For his family to live, everybody on the plane has to die. The only way the family will survive is if the pilot follows his orders and crashes the plane. Enjoy the flight. Yo, that synopsis right there, I was like, immediately yes. Picking it up, immediately yes. And so essentially this is a hijacking story where the hijacker really isn't even on the plane. But the hijacker does say, hey, I'm not there, but I got a plan B. So the plane's gonna go down or your family's gonna die. Choose. And so we are following this pilot and him having to like make those decisions, him having to think on his feet. This story also, there is another added layer or a conversation that TJ Newman is trying to have when it comes to like Americans and how sometimes we are very separated or apathetic to things and tragedies that happen in other countries. And so I really appreciated that element of the story. However, I will say this was not as fast-paced or as well done to me as Drowning was, which is fair considering this was her debut novel. What I did enjoy a lot about this book though is that we did get a lot more perspectives of like the actual flight attendants on here and how they played a role in keeping everybody on the plane safe or attempting to. All that to say, I still did enjoy this book and I gave it a 3.5 stars. So well, it wasn't bad by any means. I will say though, after reading this book, after reading Falling and after reading Drowning, I am someone who travels a lot and I don't really have too much flight anxiety, whereas I know that that is a big thing for some people. And if you have any type of fear of flying, if you get any type of anxiety around getting in a flying bus in the sky, do not read these books, okay? Because like I said, I typically don't have any anxiety around flying, and these two books made me think long and hard about the next time that I have to get on a plane. And while these are very, very, very unlikely scenarios to happen, there's still that part of your brain that's like, but what if I'm part of that small percentage? You know, so if you're afraid of flights, skip these, babe. Okay, just skip them. But overall, my July was decent. I'm glad that I kind of just picked things up that I just wanted to read. And I think I'm gonna continue that in August. I'm gonna have more structured videos now that I'm in the swing of reading things, but it's gonna be based on things that I really am itching to pick up. And if you made it to the end of this video, leave a plane emoji for these last two books that I talked about. And if you're still here, you are my absolute favorite, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.